Hello, welcome to Webinar Wednesday at Nonprofit Hub. I'm Katie Apple, the Executive Director, and I'm going to be your host today. If you've attended our webinars before, you know that our crowd rolls in a few minutes late, so we're going to get started in about 2 minutes. Go ahead and throw your name, organization, maybe what city you're coming to us from in the chat. And our icebreaker today, fittingly, is how many grants have you applied for? Not how many you've won. We just want to know how many you've gone for. Donna, welcome from Massachusetts. Susan, you're in the right place if you haven't gone for any before. Sue, 15. Wow. Too many to count. Wow, we have a lot of Massachusetts people today. Well, you guys are all in the right place. I'm seeing a lot of we haven't gotten started yet or low numbers, and I'm glad you're here. We're going to be working with Theresa today, who is an expert, and she's going to get you all the info you need. Emma, welcome from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm in Michigan too. Okay, about 1 more minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
I always love seeing where everybody's from and all over the place. It's so fun to be able to come together in one spot, but yet from all over the country and other countries, Canada.
If you are just joining, we're about to get started. We are here today with Theresa Huff to talk about grant writing basics. I'm Katie Apple, the Executive Director of Do More Good and Nonprofit Hub. I'll be your host. Before we get started, I want to make sure that we give a shout out to our platform partner, FireSpring. FireSpring is a partner of Nonprofit Hub because we value their understanding of the nonprofit sector. They provide tools and resources to make fundraising effective and easier, including websites, annual reports, and even messaging campaigns. They have all the tools your org needs to shine as a leader. So go ahead and check them out at firespring.com. Also, a few logistical reminders. We are recording this session and we will send the video and any resources mentioned out later today. We do a giveaway during every single webinar. So if you like free stuff, come to our Wednesday webinars. This week, Blue Fox Accounting for Nonprofits has made it possible for us to give away a free membership to the Cause Network and a free Cause Camp pass. So this is your choice. It can be a virtual or in-person pass, and that is courtesy of Blue Fox. So how you win is you participate in the poll, you participate in the chat, and you stay on for the entire webinar. So we'll announce that when we send out the slide deck and video later today. So we are joined today by Theresa Huff. She is the host of the Grant Writing Simplified podcast and the go-to expert in grant writing and strategy for nonprofits. She's helped nonprofits triple their funding and maximize their impact. After winning over, oh my goodness, $7 million for schools and nonprofits, she now teaches grant writers and nonprofits the strategies they need to develop millions in scalable, long-term funding. Her podcast has been downloaded in over 90 countries and 6 continents. What continent are you not on? Antarctica? Figured. Okay.
Yes, I'm working on that one. So if anybody has connections in Antarctica, that would be so fun.
That would be cool. We'll give you a full
I might have to go there myself sometime.
No kidding. Well, Theresa works with over 3,000 students worldwide, and she is now going to help you. So Theresa, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and excited to talk to your group and see what's going on today. So welcome, everyone. It's good to have you here. Great. Glad you could join us. We're just popping in the chat how many grants you have written. So as Katie said, if you're new, where you're from and your organization and how many grants you have actually written, not one, Just how many have you written? And it looks like we've got all over the place. Some of you are brand new at it, have written a couple, and some of you have written lots. So that is awesome. So welcome, and I will share my screen here to make sure everything is set up. All right. And let me know if you have any trouble seeing that. You should see the first slide. So first of all, just as Katie said, I host the Grant Writing Simplified podcast. I started out as a special ed teacher. And then when we had kids, I wanted to stay home, but find a way to be able to work from home, but still use my degree. And at the time, I didn't realize what an opportunity that was to have such a bigger impact on something beyond myself or beyond just my classroom. I could impact an entire community. And so over the years, as I've learned and grown more about that, I still have that teaching in me that I love to teach. So now here I am, and I teach grant writing as well to other people in the space. And it's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy it. And just some fun facts. Once I started adding up, I realized, oh, wow, I've kind of done this for more than a minute. Our daughter is 18, and so I've been in education and grant writing for over 20 years. Over 3,000 students have gone through my courses. The podcast has grown way more than I expected, and it's been a lot of fun. But the thing I want to take away here is I had to really step back from the day-to-day to compile these statistics about myself. And this is something that I have learned with nonprofits, that pretty much every nonprofit or every grant writer I have worked with have some really cool facts, and they're making an incredible impact that they have never stopped to think about and they've never realized. So I would like you to take a minute and either about yourself and your career or your nonprofit, how can you showcase a fun fact about yourself or your nonprofit? And I'll stop sharing for a second. This is something that you might need to think through. You might need to spend some time later, like just go step away, go to a coffee shop or something later, and just think through what kind of impact have we made? And what is something that we could showcase? Like maybe it's the number of clients you've served over time. Maybe it's the number of meals your food pantry has served over the last year. Maybe it's the number of grants you've applied for. Ooh, here's helped get over 100 low-income essential workers, helped them get electric bicycles for their own health and for our air and climate. That's amazing, see? So when you start quantifying things like that, keep popping them in the chat as you think through. It's really fun. Plus, it gives you something unique to stand out to funders, to donors in your community. It gives you something to highlight on social media. So it's a really fun way to just take a minute. And how can you think differently? How can you think more creatively about your work and about your nonprofit and the impact that you're making? So I challenge you to just come back to this later. Make a note of that. If you think of something along the way, keep popping them in the chat. But come back to this later and think, how can you reframe and how can you incorporate this into your grant applications? And so that leads into, we need to think of grants in a very strategic approach. And we need to think through from a much bigger picture, as opposed to just, okay, here's an application. Let's answer the questions on the page. Let's step back and think about it more strategically. Drop a 1 in the chat if you feel like this some days in your work. Anybody ever feel like this is just kind of how life is from day to day? And I think in nonprofit work, so many of us can relate to this. We're wearing all the hats. We have to keep everything in the air and keep juggling. And if we drop one thing, the whole thing is just going to fall apart. But let's step back and see if we can reframe that. Instead of just having our grant strategy look like this and hope something doesn't fall apart and hope we get funding, let's look at it a little more calmly and a little more strategically. The first phase of building a grant strategy is to make sure you are really clear. And a lot of times this is what it comes back to. If you're not clear internally as an organization, then you're not sending a clear message to your donors and to your prospective funders. So this is important to make sure that you've clarified, because once you've done that, then you can make sure your priorities are aligned with potential funders, and you can look for those funders that are looking to make an impact along those same lines and with that same type of mission. And then you can work on cultivating the relationships with the funders. And then that just becomes a good, clean process that can keep going and make sure you have that clarity. But that is where it starts, is making sure you're clear internally. So when is the best time to implement a grant strategy? And by doing these things we're talking about, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So in other words, the best time to start your grant strategy is right now. Notice I did not say, when should you start applying for grants? That doesn't necessarily mean you should just start applying for grants right now. I'm saying start thinking about your strategy and how can you approach it from a more specific, deliberate place, as opposed to just, okay, let's fire off all the grants we can and hope something wins. Let's look at it as, where is the best fit? What are our priorities? And how can we find funders that align with those? So just a quick overview of this. First, make sure your nonprofit vision is really clear. Now, a vision would be like, in a perfect world, if you worked yourself out of a job because you did it so well that you solved this problem, what would that look like? And I love the example from Feeding America because it's one of the most clear and simple and impactful visions I have ever heard. It's just a hunger-free America. I mean, wow, that is so incredible. You immediately can visualize that. So have you done that within your nonprofit? And if you have, pop your vision in the chat of, like, in a perfect world, this is what it would look like if we fully did our job. So share that in the chat if you have some of those. I'd love to hear what your visions are. And then the mission is the work that you actually do. And for example, Charity Water brings clean and safe drinking water to people in developing countries. Again, that's very clear. It's also very actionable. It's what they're doing. And so have you done this? Have you gotten yours really clear? Or is it 3 or 4 paragraphs long? Nobody really knows what it is. It's buried in a drawer somewhere. It's in some file, but it's really not clear. You need to be clear so that when you're conveying this to grant funders, they can immediately visualize, oh, wow, that's what they're doing. That's why we want to support them. So make sure that you have these really defined, and this is something to come together as a team to really hash out and work through. And then make sure you're clear on your priorities. What do your top areas of focus need to be right now? And what programs are you growing? How are you meeting the needs? Once you've defined these, then you know what to look for in grant opportunities, and you know what you're trying to find funding for. But if you're not clear, or if it's muddy and you're talking about one thing over here and somebody else is talking about a different thing, then your grant applications are going to kind of be jumbled and unclear as well. So you want to make sure to come back to this core and make sure and revisit to be sure you're still working in alignment with this, because if things get off track, then something needs to be adjusted somewhere. So on a scale of 1 to 10, pop in the chat, how much organizational clarity does your nonprofit have? So on these 4 boxes that we talked about, your vision, your mission, your priorities, and your programs, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your nonprofit? And just pop that in the chat. And let's see how you are doing in those areas. And that takes us to, where do you find grants? So making sure you're clear. Again, this first phase, make sure you've gotten really clear in those areas, so then you can align your priorities. And once you've done that, then you look for the funders that match with that. There are a lot of possible places where you could find grants. And I know that feels very overwhelming for so many people that I talk to, because they're like, there's so many out there. How do I know? Where do I start? Sometimes, unfortunately, I hear people say, oh, just go to grants.gov. If you're a small nonprofit, or if you've never done grants before, I do not recommend that you start with grants.gov or with government grants. They are very complicated. There's a lot to navigate, and you need to have a lot of other pieces built up first before you move into the government grants. I recommend, if you're fairly new at grants to start small and start local. Start with private foundations or your local community foundations, because the applications are much smaller, they're much more manageable, and you can learn the process without all the pressure and deadlines and craziness of the federal grant. You can learn the different parts of a grant. You can make sure you're getting your messaging clear and refined, and you can walk through the stages of the grant cycle in a much smaller scale with less pressure. And so corporations sometimes have a foundation, and you can find this on their website. It might be called community giving or corporate philanthropy, different terms like that, but you can look on their website. Sometimes it's maybe in the footer menu, but that's usually where you can find that, and you can see what their focus is. Private foundations might be for certain areas, specific causes, or even local within your community. Sometimes there will be an umbrella organization. Where I live, there's a large umbrella organization, and then a lot of small local grants are managed by that larger organization. So they may kind of oversee them and have all of those listed on their website, and then you can choose the ones within that you want to apply for. So those are just some different types to give you an idea of what to look for. But if you have never done grants before, I would start smaller and start local to build those relationships. And that helps you build a track record of grants and build your confidence with the process. And your team can work out your systems and how you want to go through that together. Now, when you are looking for grants, it's important to go through and initially weed out pretty quickly. You have your priorities, and you're looking for funders that match with those priorities, that are looking to make that same type of impact in the community. Funders are looking for an ROI, which in the business world is a return on investment. In the nonprofit world with grants, they're not going to get their money back. So it's not a return on the money, but it is a return on impact. If they invest this money, what kind of impact is that going to make and have that ripple effect? That's where they're looking to make the most impact, the most ROI in that regard. And so you need to present your case of how you can show that you can do that. And if you find and try to twist things around into grants that are not a good fit, then that's where it really kind of gets messy, and it's very discouraging and frustrating. So if you can look quickly up front, if it's not a good fit, then you can move on to the next one. As we know, and you've probably seen, there are lots of grants out there. So we need to figure out which ones have those aligned priorities that we've talked about, which ones are in the geography that you are looking for, in the area. Now, if it says we fund these 3 counties and you're 1 county over, then they're probably not going to fund you. It's tempting to make it stretch and like, oh, we're close, but they've chosen those counties for specific reasons. And so that just gives you information. You can move on to someone else. And then the timing. This one's important to keep in mind. And if the timing is not good, you can still make a note of that one and put it on your calendar to watch for the next time around. For example, if you're wanting to fund supplies for your summer school program and the funds won't be awarded until September, that doesn't help you out with summer school. So you need to make sure the timing works. But you could watch and maybe apply in time to get it for next year's summer school. So just keep that in mind as you're looking. Is the timing feasible? If you just found a great opportunity and it's due Friday, is that feasible? Or are you going to have to throw together a sloppy application, which doesn't look good either? It doesn't make the nonprofit look good. So how can you represent well? And when you're looking for grants, where do you even find them? Let's talk about grant searches. I recommend you start local, like we talked about. Look at what's in your community and how can you build those relationships with those funders. I work with a nonprofit senior center, and we have gotten the same grant for about 5 or 6 years in a row now. And it's a wonderful opportunity for both, because the nonprofit works with senior adults. They have exercise classes and a healthy lunch program. And this funder is looking to make an impact on health in the community, and especially with senior adults. And they're really big on fall prevention, helping seniors stay independent longer. And so because of that, they have funded exercise classes, fall prevention, balance classes. It's been a wonderful ongoing thing because the program has actually grown over the years, and they've been able to continue working together and have more and more programs. And the seniors love it. It's making such an impact on their health, their outlook, their independence. And it's just been a wonderful ongoing growth process to see. And they both just have such respect for each other. So when you can find those relationships, it's really a great experience. And then I always keep track, even of the grants that are not a good fit. I still keep those on my spreadsheet in a different section, because more often than not, 6 months or so later, I'll be searching for grants again. I'll come across that same one, and then I'll spend all that time looking through just to realize, oh, wait, I already looked through this one. I thought it was great, and it's not. And here I've spent time going through it again. So if I keep track, even if it's a no, it's the wrong area, whatever the issue is, I still have that, so I can make my search a lot more efficient to know that, oh yeah, that one's not for us, keep moving, and then move on to the next one. And then that helps you also revisit, like, this wasn't good last year, but now that we have more funding and more programs in place, we can come back to. So I still keep track of those, even the ones that aren't a good fit. And then sometimes I just do Google searches using different terms, especially for local grants. But then there are a lot of good tools out there. And these are just a few examples, but Instrumental, of course, Grant Station, Grant Watch, there are several others, Grant Gopher, quite a few others that I don't even know all the names. Grant Holster, I believe, is one. And then Candid, which used to be the Foundation Center database. A lot of times local libraries will have a subscription to this, to the larger, more in-depth database that you can access for free. I know my library has it on site where you can go and just do a search. So I just go in and run searches, email the results to myself, do all kinds of different combinations, and then later I can go back and have that for reference. So you might check with them as well to see if you can get that free access, because that is also a large database. But I usually kind of cross-reference and try out different tools, because sometimes you may find different grants in different places. And again, also just Google search and word of mouth. Sometimes the small local foundations are not published anywhere. We just kind of have to know from connections and from staying in contact with those funders each time. I emailed one the other day because they don't have a website. They don't really publish it. So I just checked in with her and she said, yeah, we'll probably be posting it next month, so email me back. So some of them you just kind of have to stay in the loop and pay attention and use different sources. Don't rely on any one place to do your grant searching. Then, so those are kind of basic initial tips. Now, if you want to really dig deeper, say you find some grants that you think, okay, these grants might be a really good possibility. Let's dig deeper and see and evaluate that. So first, I like to look at past awards to see the amount, the types of projects they have funded, the types of programs, the area, the scope of the project, all those different pieces, just to see, okay, what are they working on? What's their focus? If they've done all symphony, orchestra, the arts type projects, and I've got a food pantry, that's probably not going to be a good fit. But if they have similar projects, then that might be worth exploring a step further. And then also you can find a lot of information in the Form 990 on their past awards, their budget, board members. You can look for connections like that. So that can be a great tool to dig into and to also see trends over time. And some of those grant databases that we looked at in the past one, Instrumental, and some of those have really good historical data in charts and things as well. And so it's important to keep in mind, because it is so overwhelming. At some point, I kind of just had to accept the fact that I will never be able to uncover every single grant opportunity out there. That would be completely impossible. It would be like trying to count all the sand at the beach. You just can't do it. So I had to accept that and realize I don't need to look for all the grants. I'm just looking for ones that are the best fit for my clients to help them be successful. So we're just looking for the good fit grants. And think about what is enough for your nonprofit. how many grants are enough, and how much funding is enough. Maybe you don't need millions and millions of dollars. Maybe you just need a small amount. So that's important to think through. All right. So question number 3, what is in your community? And this is interesting because sometimes even I have found grants just by literally looking around at the businesses, the companies, the restaurants, the places that I drive by every day in my community, and thinking through, have I ever considered, does Dollar General have a grant? And what do you know? They do. They have several literacy grants. And I actually wrote one for a nonprofit daycare I worked with, and we got it. And so just looking at what is in your community. One time we got a Lowe's grant for a small school. They didn't have a bell system in their new edition of their school. And so if there was a tornado or fire drill or anything, they had to either call the classrooms one by one or run through the halls yelling, fire, fire. Not a good plan. And so we were able to get a Lowe's grant because of that. I explained the situation, talked through that with them, and they got the funding. And they were about 30 minutes away from a Lowe's store. So sometimes just really looking at what companies are right here that may or may not come up in the grant searches, but they may be a great fit for the type of work you're doing, and they may love the idea of making an impact on your nonprofit right there down the road. So think through and look at what opportunities are there. Kind of like those fun facts that I asked you about in the beginning, what's in front of you that maybe you haven't framed that way. Well, also, what grant opportunities might be right in front of you that you never thought about? So look through the possibilities there. All right, let's talk a little bit about what's in a grant. Now, grants come in all shapes and sizes. And so a lot of it is, it depends. It depends on the funder. Each funder is a little different. The questions they ask may be worded slightly differently, but usually they're going to want the same types of information. And these are typical parts that you'll find in most every grant. They're all going to want to know a little bit about your background. Where have you come from? How long have you been up and running? Who do you serve? What types of projects do you do? What are the statistics of your demographics? All those types of things. They're also going to want to know, why do you need this funding? And again, be tracking so that you can show there's this much poverty in our area, or we have this much need because whatever it is. And show that with statistics and stories. And you need a balance of both. Make sure you're not just telling stories without numbers to back it up. But if you just have cold, hard numbers, it's not really going to tug at the heartstrings unless you can paint a compelling picture. So it's good to have that balance. And then your project design, make sure you have a really clear plan step by step of how you're going to implement the project if it's funded and what you're going to do with that. And then how are you going to measure whether or not it was effective? This is where you'll need to have good goals and objectives. So a broad picture and then specific step-by-step measurement of how you'll know if it was successful. Make sure you explain your capacity to manage the program, why you're qualified, why your people are good to handle these funds and implement this project, and sustainability. Grant funders don't want to be your first dollar or your only dollar. So how can you explain how you will carry this out and how these funds will actually help you be more stable long-term, and that you have other funding coming in besides just grants? And then make sure you have justified the budget and how you will spend the money. And each item in the budget needs to be justified and tied back to your program design. Now, sometimes you'll have other pieces, like they might want to see budget quotes or a logic model. So just read the guidelines carefully because, like I said, every grant is a little bit different, but make sure that you've included everything that the funder is specifically asking for. And it's important as you're putting together your application, an RFP here in the middle stands for request for proposal, by the way. That might be worded slightly differently, RFA, request for applications, notice of funding announcement, but the RFP, those are the guidelines that spell out exactly what they want. And the important thing to remember is that if you have your grant application and you were to pick up any two sections and compare them side by side, would they make sense together? Would your need match up with your program design? The things you say you need and are really struggling with, would that match up with what you say you want to do in your project? And does that match up with what you asked for in the budget? So make sure it all is in alignment with each section and makes sense all the way through. And then this is just a snapshot of things that are really helpful to just have on hand. Whether it's for grant applications or other projects, you need to make sure that you have all these things handy so that you're not looking it up every time. And as a new grant writer, I don't know how often I was going back, either looking up a client's address and phone number every time, or I finally just memorized it, when finally I realized, wait, I just need to keep those in a central place and have my files organized. And so make sure you label things clearly, have the documentation, the financials, your board member list, all the information handy so that you can pull from that much more quickly, and it helps your work go a lot more efficiently and clearly. It helps not have so much room for error, because when you get down to a grant application deadline, sometimes it can be a little tight and you're trying to just plug stuff in. You don't want to have to go track some of this down at the last minute. So a lot of you, it looks like, have written grants before, which is awesome. So I'm going to give you a few pro grant writing tips and some practice here. One thing that you can do, especially if, say, a local foundation grant doesn't have a lot of guidance on how long it has to be, what kind of font. The federal grants are really strict, but some of the foundation grants, you have a lot more leeway and you can actually implement some creativity. So sometimes when I have a lot of kind of boring statistics, I mean, who wants to read a paragraph with all of this written out of, in 2011, we had 13,386 volunteer hours. And in 2012, blah, 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 blah. Who wants to read all that, let alone try to process number after number after number and think through, okay, what are they even trying to say to me? Think about the reviewer on the other side and imagine them having to sift through all that data. How can you clearly convey it? So with this, I just had a sentence or two saying our volunteers are so committed, and here's the growth that we've had. It's been tremendous. We've grown by whatever percentage over the last 4 years. And then I show this chart. So just immediately they can see, wow, it's really stepping up. And the same thing with this one, the lunch program and the number of meals they served over time. As of several years ago, they had 13,000 meals that year. That sounds like a lot, but then by 4 years later, they were up to 20,000. Wow. And you can just immediately see the growth at a glance. That helps your brain process quickly. It's a visual, it's immediate. Then you can dig in and look at details, but that reviewer can immediately see the impact and the direction it's going. So what are you saying? How can you make your data super impactful and super clear? Make it look professional and easy to read right off the bat. Now, here's an exercise for you. One thing that I talk about a lot on the podcast and with clients and with my students in my program is to really write tight. And that's sometimes because we are on tight character counts or word counts in an application. So we have to write tight. But it's also because that makes your writing better and more interesting and more compelling. How can you be clear, concise, and compelling? And help them visualize what's possible when they're reading it. So here's an example. If someone had said, if we were awarded this grant, we could offer an after-school tutoring program that could potentially help 100 students improve their grades. Okay, so when I say active voice or active writing, you want to watch for words kind of like, if we were awarded. That's kind of a past tense way of saying it. Or we could offer, we would be able to, it could potentially help. Do you see kind of those trigger words to watch for? How about instead, what if you, and feel free, if you want to do a quick exercise and pop this into the chat, how could you reword this to be so much more impactful, more powerful, and active voice and use a whole lot fewer words than what is here. And if some of you want to take a stab at it and pop this in the chat, I'll leave this up for a second. I'll see if anyone... Yeah, so some of you pop this in the chat if you want to share and rephrase this. But this is great practice to even take some of your own writing and practice this with something that you've watched, that you've actually written. Go back and look for things like this. And instead, maybe say it more like, with these funds, we will provide 9 months of after-school tutoring to improve the reading scores of 100 at-risk students. See how much more powerful that is? And instead of saying, if we were awarded this grant, we said, with these funds, we will. And instead of just saying the after-school program, we quantified 9 months of after-school tutoring to improve the reading scores. And you could even take it further by to improve reading scores by 20% of 100 at-risk students, or, worded better, but see what I mean? More defined, more tight, and more active. With these funds, we will do this. So paint the picture for them as if it's happening and this is what we can do together, as opposed to being polite and wishy-washy and we could do this. Just own it, take that action and show them what can happen. And if you want to see side-by-side examples, here's a chart that I did on my site. You can go to theresahuff.com/write-tight. And I have some side-by-side sentences that I have tightened up just to kind of help you get started and to start thinking in this way of how to really tighten up your writing, because that's a huge thing with grants, is being able to do that. And so one other piece is addressing red flags head on. Now, sometimes people are afraid to do this. They think, oh no, if we talk about those things, they'll think that, oh, it's terrible and they won't want to fund us. So we'll just sweep it under the rug and we hope they don't notice. But that's exactly what the funder is going to notice and is going to zero in on and say, well, I don't know, that's kind of could be an issue. So we're not real confident in funding them. We're going to pass on this one. But instead, what if you flip that around and address that up front? Like, for example, say the previous director just retired. They'd been there a long time, good programs, and now they're gone. That could be a red flag to a funder saying, okay, are things unstable now? What's going on here? Do you even have a plan? Is it going to fall apart? So how could you address that in the grant application to where the funder is more at ease and to reassure them that you have a plan? So, for example, you could say the new director has a background in social work and experience with implementing this curriculum. See how that's immediately shifted that to where now it's not a red flag. It's just saying our director retired. We have a new one in place. They have experience with this. So you're just explaining you have the plan for it. You're solid. You've addressed it. And now you're inviting the funder to be a part of the plan and a part of the solution. It completely flips the script on that. So instead of being afraid of the red flag, we can just address it. And then it's not a red flag anymore. I did an episode on this last week. If you want to go into listen to it in more detail on this specific topic of how important it is to just own it and be transparent if there are issues, because funders know nonprofits aren't perfect and they don't expect us to be. But it is important to just be straightforward and to be proactive and have a plan for those things that might come up. So, challenge question again, what's a potential red flag that you could explain or minimize the risk just by saying, here's an issue, we have a plan for it, and we're working on it? How can you switch that around to where it's not a red flag anymore? It might just be, yeah, we've kind of had this bump in the road, but we're working on it. So think through that and don't be afraid of those in your applications. So just to recap quickly, as you're going to implement these steps and these things that we've talked about, I know I've thrown a lot at you today and we've touched on a lot of topics, but first, how can you showcase more creatively and look at the resources that are right in front of you that you might be overlooking or might not have realized that is actually a huge strength within your nonprofit or within yourself if you're working to be a grant writer. How can you take a more strategic approach to applying for grants and building that strong foundation first? How can you find the best fit grants as opposed to just shooting out as many applications as we can find and hope for the best? And practice your writing. It really does take practice. That is the best way that I've become a better writer over the years, is just more and more. And that writing tight, while it's painful at the time, it's actually been extremely helpful to improve my writing and to make me think more creatively. And so I have a couple of resources for you. If you are interested in grant writing, I have a quiz you can take. Do you have what it takes to be a grant writer? And it just walks you through some questions. And then nonprofits, I have a free grant readiness audit to help you understand how grant ready are we. It's not good or bad, it's just information. And then that helps you know, okay, based on where we are right now, here's what we need to do next, and figure out your next steps in that way. So feel free to go check those out. And I know we also, in the podcast, of course, you can find it on any podcast player, Grant Writing Simplified. But I want to make sure we have a few minutes for questions as well. So I will flip over to that and let Kara or Katie jump on.
That was amazing. And there was really good chat happening.
Good.
Really good discussion on grants. So we do have a couple questions. The first one is from Loretta. Our last two presidents died during COVID and another cancer. Do we address that, or do we just gloss over it?
That's a great question. It depends on the funder, and I assume you may be talking about executive director when you say president, as opposed to board president.
I would assume the same thing. Loretta, if you want to clarify in the chat, feel free to.
I would make a very tight, succinct statement about it that explains and that just kind of gives a quick summary of, due to serious health problems, we've had some turnover because of this. Here's our plan for moving forward. Like, you don't have to go into a lot of detail on each one or a lot of explanation, but because of that turnover, I would say it wouldn't hurt just to briefly address it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a real hardship.
That's rough. And I mean, a funder, by addressing it that way, they're going to feel with you. They're going to feel for you. And, oh, how can we support? And then show how, also compare that with what stability do you have? How have your programs kept going even throughout that? Who has stepped in? How has your team kind of helped fill the gaps and come together? Maybe it's given other people the chance to step into some leadership roles. And so you can maybe kind of also highlight that, hey, we've had some board members really step up. We've had a couple staff members, volunteers. The team has really come together to help keep some stability in the organization. So not knowing all the specifics, but I would say if you could frame that into also an explanation to show how you've managed to still keep it going, but yet address that we've had some rough waves here.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, lots of questions coming in. This is a great one from Jennifer. So many of the applications that I've come across have character limitations. I hate that.
That's tough.
It can be difficult to include visuals. Is there another way to provide supportive data effectively?
I'm glad you asked that. Sometimes it depends on the application itself, but I have had a couple of applications like that, and those character limits can be a killer. But I had one where I had one final question that said, please attach any additional information that you think might be helpful in helping us make this decision. And so I used that to include some testimonials, a couple of pictures of the items we were asking for, because again, it was for the senior center. And so some of the exercise equipment was very specific to seniors. It wasn't just your typical treadmill. It was a specific kind of balance board with, special helping them not fall, or a certain walker. So I included pictures and an explanation of why these items were especially beneficial for this population. So if you get a question like that, use that to your advantage. Or another time I was able to work it into the budget narrative because that didn't have the page restrictions or the character limits that the other sections did. And then sometimes we do have those constraints, and there's unfortunately just no way around it. So try and get creative within the constraints you have to work in as much as possible.
Okay. Kenneth says this was an amazing session, so thank you.
Thank you.
He's asking, how can I best frame the problem statement using an example?
Okay, like the problem that you're working with. Let's see, I'm thinking of a food pantry that I used to write grants for. And so they worked with families. They also had a backpack program for students. And then they would sometimes do housing and senior assistance depending on the situation. So the funder that we were talking to, I would highlight whichever problem was most relevant. Like in our background, I might give a broad statement of we help with food, this, and this. But then if it was a funder that we were specifically asking for funding for the backpack program for students, then I would really highlight that we have this many students in poverty in our school district. We have this many students in the program. There's this much need. It's grown by this much since last year. There's no other food pantry. So I would just kind of paint that picture of why there's a need and how we can help meet that need for that specific area. As opposed to trying to explain everything we do, I would just really focus in on that one piece that matched with that funder. Does that answer what you were looking for?
I think it does. Kenneth, feel free to throw in the chat if you'd like more explanation. Another question from Jeff, and this is another super relevant one. So they're a brand new organization. How do they address that issue with funders?
Ooh, that's a great question. I hear that a lot. And sometimes the best way is to realize that maybe you're not quite grant ready yet, but you can be doing things right now to get grant ready. Because again, grant funders don't want to be your first dollar or your only dollar. So be spending your efforts on other types of fundraising and getting some consistent funding in, and start tracking the data that you're going to need to show in grants, how many clients you're serving, how your programs are growing, the need in the community. Start keeping track of those. So then in a year or two or a few months down the road, when you are more ready for grants, then you have those things compiled. You're not trying to figure out, oh, wait, we should have been tracking all this stuff. Now you've got it in place. So that's one thing that I work with a lot on nonprofits, and I talk about it a lot on the podcast, is that grant readiness piece, because that is so foundational to make sure you're ready. Then when you do start applying, you'll have much more success, and your efforts are much better used with other fundraising when you're early on, building those strategic relationships, getting a solid board. Make sure you have other types of funding in place first, and then move into grants.
Absolutely. Okay, similar question, but a little bit different. So Susan's asking, how do we address slow growth of our agency?
It depends on your situation, but I would look at, by growth, do you mean programs or do you mean funding? And what do you have that is stable? And so I would look at those things. What can you explain and quantify that is stable? And yours may be the type of program that's not going to ever just explode. It may stay small. Like if you're a small local museum, that's probably going to kind of stay within that same type of service and type of project. It's not like maybe a school that the program is going to grow because people are moving in and it becomes huge. So depending on your situation, that may be okay as long as you're staying stable and as long as your organization is consistent with the programs that you're doing.
And growth is growth. I see a lot of organizations shrinking. So, yeah.
Right, that's true. And, also sometimes comparison with other nonprofits is not the healthiest thing, because every nonprofit's different and your growth may be different than someone else's, but you're not comparing apples to apples. So focus on what you're doing well and do that the best you can and keep staying consistent with that in your lane.
Okay, Donna has a situation. So they were closed for most of the pandemic since we share a space with the library. She's a new director. They have a small staff and they need to get back up and running. She wants to know how they address that they are now open with new people in some of the same programs. So
Okay.
it sounds like kind of a radical shift from what they were to what they are today due to the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Kind of running and a pause and now sort of a regroup, reframe. I have found that funders have been extremely understanding about the pandemic, about funding, about requirements. They have been really flexible. And even like grants that we were awarded kind of early on or at the beginning of the pandemic, they were so good about extensions on reporting and projects when normally that would not have gone over well. But what I've found, especially that's the advantage again of some of these local foundations and building the relationships because they are so understanding. So I would just be upfront with that of here's the kind of success we were seeing. We were forced to stop for a while. We're now back up and running. Here's what we're doing. So you're still pulling from that past success and showing that you do have a track record, but then you're showing how everything is different now. And, I would say probably a lot of organizations have not just picked up exactly as is before the pandemic. Everything has had to shift and rethink how we're approaching things. And so just explaining that because of all these changes, here's where we are now. We've restarted with this in place instead. And here's why. And here's what we're doing. So just explaining that. And I would think funders will be very understanding.
Okay, here's another, this is a good question. So Nicholas is from Uganda and he has a nonprofit. He's interested in applying to organizations in the US, but he's wondering how to get a USA organization to trust them because they are coming from another country.
Mm-hmm. I would say that comes back to relationships and being transparent and consistent about your programs, your messaging, the impact that you're making, and really showing like over time, here's the impact we've made in building relationships with people, whether it's on the boards of those nonprofits or with other people in the space so that you have connections that can vouch for you. And just really showing that credible track record over time of what you're doing and the impact you're making.
And organizations that give to overseas nonprofits, I mean, they're comfortable with that. So finding those organizations that do fund on a global level is crucial.
Right. Looking for those and just having those transparent records ready of your finances, the people, the numbers that you're impacting and the difference it's made from before and during and after to show that progress that because of you and your nonprofit, here's what's happening and then inviting them to be a part of that.
Absolutely. Okay, Sue is asking, our youth are from all over the US, but many local funders have a problem with so few members from our state, even though we represent our state. Sue, I feel you. We have issues with this too. They have a hard time with sending money with so many kids from outside Wyoming. How do they address that red flag?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. You could do it a couple of ways. You could either look for funders that are open to serving students from wherever, or you could have kind of a core program for your Wyoming students that the grant will fund this core program. But I wonder if there might be a way to creatively do that to where maybe this grant program will fund this program. But in the meantime, later, after the grant's over, you were able to build that program and use it with your Wyoming students. And maybe that was sort of a pilot program. And now because of that, you can duplicate it later in other communities. So initially, maybe it's serving your Wyoming students and the funders locally would love that. But yet for your purposes, you're also creating an asset that you can reuse long-term in other places.
I love that, like a little franchise model.
Almost, yeah. Get more mileage out of it.
Yeah, no kidding. Emma, this is a super common question. So, well, actually, there's a couple questions. Susan and Emma both have questions about administrative costs. It's very hard to get grants for administrative costs. They're wondering if you have any resources for that. And then how do you indicate, if you're going for maybe a program grant or a capital grant, how do you indicate that a portion will be used for administrative costs?
That's a great question. Usually you won't find a grant that is solely for administrative costs. So I feel your pain on that one. I wish there were, but funders understand, especially the larger the grant gets, they know it's going to take manpower and energy and time to implement it properly. They understand that you're going to have to dedicate some resources if you're responsible for $100,000 or $500,000 to make sure it's used correctly. So they know, and usually with grants of that size, you can justify in the budget because of implementing this properly. Our staff will be dedicating 20 hours a week or whatever it is. And you show, like in some grants, I have actually shown the calculation. We estimate this will take 25% of the director's time. Here's 25% of her salary in a calculation. And it's, part of our administrative and office costs and even printing supplies and things like that. We calculated a percentage of it, that it was justified in proportion to the grant and tied directly to the materials, the programs, the projects that we were doing so that we could show, and that would help offset, as opposed to just here's some money, implement it properly and take a ton of time to do it, but we're not going to offset that. You have to add that to your workload. Instead, it would help in proportion, and funders understand that. So they may not want to just say, yeah, we'll fund your whole salary. But if you can justify how much of the resources it's pulling to do the grant itself, then that's okay. It just needs to be tied together. And again, read the guidelines, because some guidelines will tell you a kind of an estimate or a recommended amount or a maximum that they would approve. And they may say, yeah, we'll do this much, but maybe you asked for 10,000 and they say, well, we won't do that much, but we'll do 7,000. So, there's some flexibility sometimes in that.
Okay. So Anita has, I have to tell you, this is the question that we hear probably most often. Is there grant funding for new nonprofits, like a startup grant?
It is tough to find. I have seen a couple that were more like an underwriter or a sponsorship. They called it a grant, but it was more like they had found someone and built a relationship, and the corporation agreed to underwrite their startup costs, but it wasn't a competitive grant application. So they're few and far between, and they're highly competitive when they are. But really, again, your time is better spent developing relationships with funders and donors and having those fundraisers, because grant funders want you to have some skin in the game as well. They want to see that you're stable and they're investing in your programs and not in something unknown. So they want to invest in something that they can see is getting results, and they want to become a part of that, of helping you do that.
Well said, well said. Okay, Pamela is asking, can you offer guidance as to how much time to spend on writing narratives? Sometimes it's hard to let go when you want it to be just perfect.
Oh, yes, that is so true. And and sometimes the deadline forces that. Like, okay, here's the deadline, time's up, ready or not. And kind of like with the grant searches, I have had to just be okay with knowing that there's always room for improvement. And every grant I write, I get better and better. And the narratives, I also try to spend time in proportion to the points. If there's a point value given, sometimes in a grant, it will say this section is 5 points, this section's 20 points. So I try to really focus on making sure the higher point sections are well refined and well said and laid out. If that's not given, then I try to have some really good core pieces about the background, the history of the organization already from past applications that we've worked on together. And then I can use that to where I'm spending more time on the other parts that are new to this application. And then just to keep refining and just knowing that it's a process of getting better and better each time. and having to just let go of the perfection, because sometimes that's tough. But yeah, at some point it's better to know this is a job well done, let's get it out the door, and as opposed to being absolutely perfect, because there is that fine line. You don't want sloppy work, you don't want to just send out a mess, but it sounds like you're not. It sounds like you're really diligent and paying attention to the detail. So give yourself permission to just, okay, let's go, we've done the best job we can and represented it well.
Wonderful. So we are out of time. We're going to keep going, but before we do, because I know some people will have to drop off, we are working with Theresa to launch a grant writing course for beginners in May. So if you're going to Cause Camp, the course will actually be announced there, but we are going to include a link to sign up for the wait list in the follow-up email. So watch for that. And then if you want to stick around for about 5 more minutes, we will do probably about 2 to 3 more questions. So this is a really relevant one. I've heard this a ton too. Catherine's asking, so far with my grant applications, I've been ghosted. How do I know what to improve if the funder never responds?
Ooh, ouch. That's painful. Yeah. And ideally you would get feedback, but sometimes you don't, and sometimes the funder just doesn't. And so I would say if that's the case, and if you can't get a response, then maybe just step back and evaluate for yourself. Are we clear on our message? Kind of go through that pyramid, that triangle again. Is our initial mission, our values, all those pieces, is it clear and concise and compelling? And are we finding funders that are a good fit, or are we just randomly sending things out? And then also make sure you've evaluated the funder a little more thoroughly, if you haven't yet, of just what are their past awards like? What kinds of things have they done in the past? The amounts, are you asking in alignment with those, or are you off base? And then the other thing that I like to do is to just call the funder before I apply and just say, would you mind if I just ran a couple of ideas by you to see if it's in alignment with what you're looking for? And I mean, more than 9 times out of 10, they are happy to talk to you. That's what they're there for. They would much rather get good quality applications in. So usually the person in the office, unless it says not to call, but usually they are thrilled that you called. They're happy to help you out. It helps you understand a lot better of what to include in the application and how you can tweak that. So if they're ghosting you and not giving feedback, then maybe you can do some things to be proactive on the front end to see if there's something you can do to increase your success rate there.
Okay. We are going to go ahead and wrap it up. If your question didn't get answered, we will make sure there's a way to follow up with Theresa in the follow-up email. I'd also encourage you to follow her on LinkedIn. She's a thought leader in this space, and you will gain wisdom just by reading her posts and following what she shares info on. So thank you so much, Theresa.
This has been fun.
Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been great. And thanks everybody for all the comments. I look forward to reading through those and seeing, your other questions that we didn't have time to answer. Maybe sometime we can do another one and go through some of those.
Absolutely. Actually, we already got an email from somebody saying, are you going to do this session again? So
good.
It will be on the calendar soon. Okay.
Good. I'd love to.